This is Bangkok's famous red light district, but a few streets away, children are being hired for sex. It makes me ask, is morality just personal opinion, constructed by culture? Is it relative? Or do some things make right and wrong so obvious that we could call them moral absolutes? And where could we get moral absolutes? From nature, society, the individual, or from God? Big questions. This time we'll look at morality in people and in nature. Do we just construct morality, or is it timeless and objective?
It's a very common argument from Christians that, oh, well, you don't have a source of objective morality, which is just freaky, because what's objective about your impressions of what God is beaming into your head? It's
If you're looking for an absolute moral fact that transcends all cultures and all places, and it's right or wrong regardless of what a culture thinks, then I think the only answer to that would be is if you believe that there's a God who's established a universal moral code.
Some say we're accidents in a universe born by chance. Some say we're children of God. I'm Grenville Kent, a Christian academic, and the new atheists have got me questioning my faith. So I'm going wherever the questions take me, with my ever-curious son, Marcus, and talking to leading thinkers on both sides of the God question. Because I really want the evidence. Is there a God? And will I ever find a hat that fits? It may seem strange to look for moral absolutes in a place where you can buy any drug or sexual experience, including with a young child. But it's at the extremes that morality can become clearest. I left Marcus home for this topic and talked to some aid workers.
The sex industry in Thailand is quite large. Estimates range to about 800,000 persons being involved in the sex industry. Primarily female, but some male as well. About 200,000 are under the age of 16.
It's hard to accept in reality, but there's this group of people that have sexual services with children. And crimes of sexual exploitation of children, it's not the light, fluffy kind. It's really violent, aggressive crime against children. Some of the cases I've seen, children as young as 4 have been victimized. And you can't tell me a child 4 is ready for any type of sexual activity.
The UN estimates that within Asia, over the last 3 decades, there's been about 30 million people have been trafficked.
When children are exposed to so much trauma, abuse physically, psychologically, and all the stuff they have to go on, they turn on survival mechanisms inside. Whatever allows them to cope in the environment they're in. And think with all that pain, many turn to drugs, many just accept their situation, and sometimes in order to advance in that society to live in, they become part of the trafficking gangs and recruiters. So that's usually or some commit suicide.
Because of the nature of the commercial sex industry, there's a high turnover. And so there's a constant search for new bodies, as it were. And that's the role of the agents in the human trafficking chain, to constantly search for new young people to be lured or trapped into the commercial sex industry.
Where do these children come from? And where are their parents? I left Bangkok and went up the Mekong River to see where the recruiters work. We're heading up into the Golden Triangle area, the border between Myanmar, Laos and Thailand. And it's actually quite dependent on agriculture up there. There's not a strong economy. And so a bad season means debt.
An agent comes into their village and says, oh, I can find a job for your daughter as a waitress or a shop assistant, and I can pay you up front maybe 10 or 20,000 baht, which is $300 to $600. For a family that's in debt to a loan shark, maybe up to 50% interest per year, For them, that's a huge relief. And so allowing their child, maybe 12, 13, 14-year-old, to leave the home is a way out of their problem.
Imagine being a parent in that position. They make handicrafts and sell them enthusiastically. I met a sweet little girl and wondered what her future might be.
Regardless of what background you come from, whether it's faith-based or non-faith-based, clearly, I think, for a normal, rational human being, the value of protecting children is self-evident.
I'd say child sex tourism is wrong, and child protection is a moral absolute. Always, everywhere. No ifs, no buts, no exceptions. Wouldn't you? And yet here's the problem. Some people say there's no such thing as a moral absolute. Many atheists have traditionally said that. I went to the Global Atheist Convention, and among the celebrity atheists I met biologist Dr. P.Z. Myers.
We construct our morality. We build a morality that works for us. Where my moral feelings come from is from my experience and from my interactions with other people, and what I find to be satisfactory interactions with other people, things that make me happy and make them happy and allow us to work together. So what our morality is it derives from the fact that we are social species. We rely on our coexistence in a tribe, in a group, in a family, in order to survive the threats of nature. And that what we have had to do over our cultural history is develop a pattern of interactions that allows us to coexist. That's morality. That's all it is. There's no imposition from above. It's all bubbling up from below.
I met Christian author Clifford Goldstein.
Is there a moral fact, or are there just moral opinions? It really depends on your concept of who we are and why we're here. It would seem to be that if there were no God, there were no transcendence, and that morality would be just very cultural. You can be a moral relativist. You just can probably never give an absolute firm reason for the moral views that you hold. And then somebody might be fine with that. They might say, well, I don't need an absolute firm reason. My culture, I believe that, molesting little children is bad, and, I might not be able to ground it in some absolute eternal truth. I don't need to. You could say, well, we're never going to go beyond this. Then 20 years later, well, we got used to this, and we go beyond, and we've seen this, and suddenly you're doing things that you would have been horrified for. That is the danger.
Evolution has no particular directed goal. It has no particular values that say intelligence and goodness and, handsomeness are at all necessarily fit. The real test of a successful morality is that it allows a population, a culture to thrive for long periods of time. And that's empiricism again. That's science. So you could say, well, we could pit an Islamic theocracy against a Western democracy and see who wins 1,000 years from now. That's science, that's determining it. But I don't think I can a priori say which one would win.
Professor Alistair McGrath is a scientist and Christian theologian.
If there were no God, then I would be forced to say, as a matter of intellectual honesty, that there is no ultimate morality. There is no ultimate purpose. I may invent goodness, I may invent purpose, and I can say to myself, this is the best I can do, let's learn to live with it. But I'd be saying in parenthesis, but it's not really very satisfactory. I would, in effect, be living a delusion. I'd be living within a set of values, including meaning and goodness, which I had invented to suit me.
If you start, inferring that this one imaginary creature has the supreme authority and can dictate what you're supposed to do. So I reject that categorically. But John Lennox apparently thinks that's just wonderful.
Professor John Lennox is a mathematician and Christian writer.
If God does not exist, then everything is permissible. Now, that's a much quoted statement, and it's much misunderstood because Dostoevsky was not saying that atheists cannot be moral beings. Of course they can. What he was saying is that when you look at it rationally, if there isn't a God, there is no base, rational base, for morality. Now, it's interesting to pursue that because it's admitted by various people. The arch-atheist who's always worth listening to is Nietzsche. And he pointed out that if you get rid of God, you'll in the end get rid of all values. And he would actually laugh, I suspect, at many of the contemporary Western atheists who want to retain some kind of Western liberal democratic values and still be atheists. He would say that's not possible.
Could anyone argue that sex with children is morally justifiable? In fact, some people try.
Pedophiles, for them, they're not hurting the children. They think what they do is normalized and part of their actual normal behavior. They don't see anything wrong. Child sex tourists or traveling child sex offenders, they try to justify by saying like children, for example, in Thailand are poor and they're helping the children. It's culturally acceptable here, which is not, but they convince themselves and try to justify that it's normal. I think they live in their own isolated bubble where their moral compass is off.
Some academics have been understood as supporting pedophilia. They refused our request for interview. You could argue for moral relativism in a university and sound clever, but could you really come here and be a relativist about child sex trafficking? So if a child sex tourist said they were born that way, and so you can't judge and you have to tolerate, and even if a whole culture approved of child sex abuse, would that convince you? Or are some actions just clearly wrong? So I think we just found a moral absolute. Some new atheists believe there are moral absolutes. Sam Harris has written a leading book trying to build morality on science, and he disagrees with his friend P.Z. Myers.
Moral relativism, I just think, is neither honest nor compassionate in the end.
I asked him why.
It's obvious that morality has something to do with human well-being, questions of happiness and suffering. And not just human well-being, but the well-being of anything that can have well-being, the well-being of any conscious creature.
You write about moral truths, and you're not a moral relativist. In fact, you call it nonsensical. Why is that?
It's clear that while there may be some elasticity in moral truth, it's not infinitely elastic. I mean, it's possible to be wrong in your claims to right and wrong, and that's what inspired me to write the book, The Moral Landscape.
You write that most secular educated people don't believe there are moral facts. They think there are moral opinions and moral preferences and kind of emotional reactions that we mistake for the knowledge of genuine right and wrong.
Well, it has been a dogma of Western academia in the last 50, 75 years. I mean, anthropology has given us this to some degree. There are cultures that view women this way. There are cultures that view women in a diametrically opposed way. How can we ever sort it out? I mean, it's the fact that the human preference is that malleable seemed to testify to there being no ground truth as to what's going to cause a culture or a person to thrive. That has created a bias of non-judgmentalism and political correctness.
Sam Harris's book tries to build objective morals on science. One problem he faces is that evolutionary theory says the genes in our bodies are selfish. They're focused only on their own survival. So why would they want us to be moral or fair to others, let alone generous or altruistic? Sam Harris suggests 4 possible reasons why they might. We'd want to be kind to our close relatives because they carry copies of our genes. And so even if we sacrifice ourselves for them, our genes still live on. That's kin selection.
It's not so much that you should care about your kin or people who you're possibly related to. It's just that as a genetic story, as a story of evolutionary psychology, this is why you would tend to care. I mean, caring has been a good strategy to make successful creatures like you in the past. But it's not an argument that you will be better, you'll be happier if you cared.
I'd care for others who would care for me and my children. That's reciprocal kindness. I'd care if others saw me caring, and that got me a great reputation, which helps me and my children. And I'd care because it would advertise me as a rich, resourceful mate and a fantastic breeding partner, and raise my chances of reproduction. Charles Darwin himself argued that one, and it's called sexual advertising.
The relevance of sexual selection to things like altruism is that it's a sign of just immense resources. You know, you are so fit and worthy a mate that you can just squander your resources on strangers.
So let's test Sam Harris's reasons by asking whether they'd motivate you to give to children in Bangkok. Kin selection. Okay, but these children are not your close relatives. Logically, it'd be better to spend your money on children whose genes are a more exact copy of yours. Reciprocal kindness? Great. But what are the chances that a poor child in a foreign country will live to help you? Seems like a poor investment if that's why you're doing it. Reputation theory? But is that really the main reason people care for others and give to charities? Don't most of us find showy giving a bit repulsive? And sexual advertising. Is giving to charity really a great way to make yourself attractive to the opposite sex and increase your breeding potential? I mean, seriously? Those reasons wouldn't persuade me to spend $1 for a child here in Bangkok. And yet people do. They do give to charities. They do care for others. And it seems today's major atheist account of morality can't explain why.
I respect Sam for trying it, and I agree entirely with him that any morality that's worth anything is going to be rationally derived. So in that very broad sense, I kind of agree with him that we can use a science, a moral calculus, where we figure out what's the thing that maximizes cooperativity, happiness, and productivity of a population. And that's a way to do that with science. Where I find myself a little uncomfortable is I don't think there's one solution to that. I think there are many solutions that work. But I don't think you can drive those scientifically. You can't say that there's a scientific justification for personal liberty. And so we always have to bring in those values.
One of the big questions that many people debate is, why are people good towards others? Because in one sense, you know, if I'm a selfish person, well, what benefit is there in doing this? Or indeed, what survival value is conferred by doing this? And these are fair questions. And it seems to me that you probably could accommodate altruism within an evolutionary system, but you have to bring in additional ideas that actually come from outside it. In other words, it doesn't generate these moral values by itself. You have to bring them in from somewhere else. I know very few scientists who would say that you can generate a morality on the basis of a scientific approach. I think Sam Harris's book actually proves why. He ignores the obvious objections. How on earth can you get from this is happening to this is what ought to be happening? You can't do it from a scientific perspective precisely because science is about observing and describing. It's not about prescribing.
He made as good of an effort as I think you could, trying to, build a morality from biology and evolution alone. I think most people, even if they're atheists, even if they're evolutionists, would say he probably failed. From my perspective, when I read it, I think he failed miserably, but it certainly showed somewhat how difficult it is.
If you look at the history of ethics, there are massive debates. Is ethics about the individual or about the group? How do we begin to calibrate rightness and wrongness? And what I see Harris doing, in effect, is taking science and almost fitting in what he thinks is right with science, and then saying, hey, science has proved this. It's all about an accommodation of Harris's existing moral beliefs with a very idiosyncratic take on the sciences.
And does Sam Harris's theory explain well enough the extreme violence we see in nature? To think more about whether biology could give objective morals, I took part of my gene pool to look at nature up close. We've come to see a fish that definitely loves its neighbours as protein. Got that big, cold look in their eyes. They don't care about you. They just care about eating, cruising around, surviving. The top predator. From what we know of their psychology, that's it. Yet if violent selfishness keeps a predator's selfish genes alive and evolving, can a Darwinist call that immoral? If this shark decided to love his neighbour, let alone his enemy, wouldn't he be eaten, taken out of the gene pool? So how can Darwinism be expected to give us solid morality? Ask anyone who's seen a shark attack.
My son Harry was sitting on the sandhill with a little mate watching a guy surfing on his own at the break cactus. And we watched him for a few waves, and Harry called out to me, "Look, Dad, he's going to be attacked." And so I turned around and you could see that the shark was between the beach and the surfer, and then it moved to him, and then in an anti-clockwise direction, smashed and thrashed around and around and around in this, always going around in a circle. And it took the guy down under the water, and we're all looking in shock. And then he popped up and he got his board and made about 3 strokes. And it was only about 3, and then in it came again, and all hell broke loose again with it thrashing around. And it was so aggressive and vicious that it was like there was 2 sharks. There was fins and tails and water flying everywhere. It was incredibly powerful. And it took him down and thrashed around and around and around in this circle pattern. And then all of a sudden he was completely gone, and there was just a pool of blood with bits of surfboard floating. And all of us were in shock. If you're in the water and they're there and they want you, they will go you, and there's not much that's going to stop.
How can you build a morality on that, except to say survive, hurting others when necessary? But are humans just survival vehicles, blindly programmed by our genes? Or is there something more to us?
Richard Dawkins in his book gives us insight into where atheist thinking logically leads. And he says, roughly, this universe is exactly as you'd expect to find it. If at bottom there is no good, there is no evil, there is no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, if you look at that, that's the end of all morality. Indeed, he states it. There is no good, there is no evil. And what I find totally inconsistent, and many atheists also find totally inconsistent, is that the fact that Dawkins can then say God is evil and all this kind of stuff, when he is claiming there is no good and there is no evil. He sees that his philosophy is nihilistic, it's leading him over an abyss, so he has to draw back from it and say, well, we can rebel against our selfish genes. And that has created a lot of laughter, because if we are selfish genes, what metaphysical, non-material principle is there within us that can help us to rebel?
Some atheists argue there are no moral absolutes, but I couldn't tell that to a child in Bangkok or to a child sex tourist. Atheist Sam Harris sees moral absolutes, yet he tries to build them on evolutionary biology, when animal behavior shows a mix of group cooperation and violent selfishness. Basically, whatever suits my selfish gene at the time. And that doesn't make for solid morality. That seems like a serious hole in today's major atheist account of right and wrong. So should we look for a more solid foundation for the moral absolutes we see, and a worldview that makes sense of why we want to care for others? What do you think? Next time, we'll travel to Mongolia to examine 4 possible sources for morality: biology, society, individual choice, and belief in God. We'll see you then for more big questions.